After launching our Neurodiversity in the Workplace course last year, we received one question in our course feedback more than any other, and that was, how do we continue this conversation? We aim to continue this conversation through this webinar series that you're a part of in 2024. This webinar is the second of 3 that we have scheduled this year on topics related to neurodiversity. Today's presentation, it is called Advocating for Accommodations in the Workplace, and the goal is to empower you with essential tools and knowledge to thrive in your professional journey. You'll discover effective tools for self-advocacy, communication, and creating a work environment that supports your unique needs. Your presenter today will be Lindsey Telg, MOT-OTRL, Instructional Assistant Professor for the UF Department of Occupational Therapy. Take it away, Lindsey.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, my name's Lindsey. I'm an occupational therapist and an instructional assistant professor here. I'm grateful to be able to share with you some strategies and tips for advocating for accommodations in the workplace. ADA and employment law is a whole separate thing, and I don't by any means consider myself an employment law expert. And so we do have a group here at UF, the ADA office, who can help sort out some of the legal aspects of accommodations. We'll touch on them just a little bit because you can't talk about accommodations without touching on that some. But primarily the goal of our presentation and our time together today is to consider how you as an individual can advocate for accommodations in your workplace environment. If you are someone who doesn't need accommodations, but you might be working with a coworker or maybe in a position where you are potentially receiving accommodation requests, it may also be helpful for you to kind of understand what that process can look like. The ADA is the important law that kind of is the umbrella for this. The Americans with Disabilities Act was made in 1990, and it's been revised a couple times. It's designed to prevent discriminations. Specifically, Title I has to do with employment. Basically, throughout the entire life cycle of employment, a company cannot use your disability as a reason to do or not to do something related to your employment. It also provides some guidance about what kinds of questions an employer can ask you about your disability. And it's the law that requires employers to provide reasonable accommodations. We'll talk more in just a little bit about that, what that means. The term individual with a disability has a pretty broad definition. There's actually 3 parts, and the first 2 parts are the ones that relate primarily to accommodations. So we'll talk about those today. You are considered an individual with a disability if you have a substantial limitation in a major life activity. And there are a long list of life activities, but it includes things like hearing, seeing, speaking, walking, breathing, performing manual tasks, taking care of yourself, learning, working, and again, many other things. You can also be considered an individual with a disability if you have a record of the impairment, meaning you have some documentation related to that impairment. When you ask for a reasonable accommodation at work, this means basically there has to actually be a condition for which you need the accommodation. And you have to have a record of that impairment. And we'll talk a little bit more later about what you are and aren't required to provide to your employer when you're requesting an accommodation. Self-advocacy is a term that comes up frequently, and that's sort of what we're talking about today. How do you advocate for yourself in order to get the accommodations that you need? In basic terms, self-advocacy involves accessing the things that you need in order to function at your maximum and desired potential. Some people don't have to self-advocate as much in order to get the things they need. The standard things that we all get in our workplace environment might work just fine for most folks. But for some of us, the standard methods of access may not work. A really simple explanation is stairs as the only access to a building. That works just fine if you can climb stairs. But if that's hard or impossible for some reason, then that person would have to advocate for a way to enter the building that meets their needs. The sort of trick with a lot of accommodations is that they're not as obvious as stairs, of course. Many times there's things that we need or things that we find challenging that aren't quite as obvious to anybody else looking around or looking at us in our work performance, but we can feel that something about the tools we have and the ways that we're doing things just isn't working quite as well as it could be. Self-advocacy is a skill that we learn just like reading or math. It's something we learn and practice over time, and we grow those skills along the way. We typically learn how to advocate for ourselves throughout childhood and as we move into adulthood. You might be able to think about little ways that you began to assert yourself and handle challenges on your own when you were growing up. You might have started to choose your own clothes and style based on your preferences, or learned what foods you like or don't like and asked for a modification at a restaurant, or maybe asked for a refund when you were charged for items incorrectly at the store. These are some low stakes examples, meaning if you didn't advocate for yourself, the consequences probably weren't terrible. In childhood and adolescence, we hopefully have lots of these low stakes opportunities so we can practice these skills as adults. But for lots of different reasons, some people don't actually get that much practice with self-advocacy. Maybe the opportunity just didn't come up. Maybe whatever you're dealing with that you need accommodations for is something new to you, and you didn't practice or need to practice advocating about it previously. Maybe somebody in your life was really supportive, but the downside was you didn't get to practice for yourself. It's also possible that people just sort of assumed you couldn't advocate for yourself, and they underestimated your abilities and sort of just took the steps that needed to be done for you. And self-advocacy is just hard for some people. Even if you know what to do, actually doing it can be challenging. For example, if you have social anxieties, it can be really challenging to speak up to other people about what you need. So as you were growing up, you can take a moment and kind of think about some of the opportunities that you've had to practice self-advocacy. As we start thinking about asking for accommodations in the workplace, it helps to reflect on if that's going to be easy for you, hard for you. Did you have experiences where you asked for things you needed and that need was met? Or maybe you're used to asking for things you need and people told you no. Or maybe you're not even used to asking for what you need. A little bit of self-reflection on that can be an important step in order to make sure that you kind of understand as you go into this process of asking for what you need, what you might need to prepare in order to do it successfully. We're going to look at an example of self-advocacy in the workplace. There's a lot of text here, but I'm going to read it to you. Paul works in the IT department servicing hardware. He was recently diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and the MS has caused numbness and tingling in his fingers, which makes it difficult for him to hold the small tools that he uses in his work. He joins an online MS support group, and he asks if anyone has any tips. A mechanic in the group mentions a brand of tools with larger textured handles that might be easier for him. Paul wants to ask his employer to purchase a set of these tools as an accommodation so that he can continue to do his work. He researches the cost of the tools compared to the ones that are currently used, and he finds out that the new set is only about $20 more than the one they usually purchase. He takes this information to his boss. He's still getting used to his diagnosis and he doesn't really want to give details. So instead he shares, "It's getting harder and harder to use the brand of tools we have. My fingers get numb and I drop things. Could we purchase a set of these instead?" So where, and you can drop your answer into the chat, where do we see Paul gathering information and finding support? In the MS forum, yeah, exactly. So that's a form of self-advocacy, knowing how and where to reach out and get information that you need. Where do we see him using some problem solving? Talking to his colleagues, researching the cost of those tools, finding a solution, exactly. So again, problem solving being an important part of advocating. Where do we see Paul demonstrating that he knows his rights and how to speak up for himself? Yeah, he talked to his boss without revealing his diagnosis. Exactly. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's a great example of sharing what he needs without having to share the specific reason for those needs with his direct supervisor. So as we consider some of the steps to self-advocacy, the first part is that you really can't advocate for yourself if you don't understand your own challenges and what you need in order to solve them. The first step is to understand your own disability, and then you have to understand the needs that you have related to your job description. You'll need to have an idea of what reasonable accommodations would help meet your needs, and then you need to figure out how and whom to speak to somebody at your workplace. We'll go through each one of these together. First, you have to have a good understanding of your own disability. It's really important you do not have to share all of these details with your employer. We'll talk a little more about disclosing your disability a little later in the talk. This is more of an independent sort of exercise that you would want to go through before reaching out, before beginning to have a conversation with your employer. Understanding your disability is about knowing yourself. You want to think about what are some of the symptoms and how do they impact you in the workplace? Does your disability affect you differently at different times of the day or the year, or as a result of taking or not taking medication? The goal in this step is to identify all of the ways that your disability impacts you in your daily life, both at work and at home. There's an example on the slide that says, you arrive home every day from work with terrible headaches that keep you from cooking or playing with your dog. If you think about something like that, the symptom you're having or the problem you're having is happening at home. You get home from your work day, you have a terrible headache, it impacts the things you want to do at home. But if those headaches are a result of, let's say, fluorescent overhead lighting at work, it might be a reasonable accommodation to ask that the lighting be adjusted for you so that you can not have terrible headaches every day. So when we think about disabilities and our performance at work, we also want to think of the cost of accommodating ourselves all day long. And by that, I mean, many times we have a sort of grin and bear it kind of approach. I'm not going to ask for anything. I'm just going to muscle through it. But as you're thinking about your disability, I'd encourage you to think about what impact that has on you later in the day when you leave. Because it is possible that you need some modifications during your workday so that your entire life, both here and outside of work, are things that aren't impacting the daily tasks that you want to do. So if I was working with you one-on-one as a client, or we were having an individual conversation, I'd ask you to write down some of your symptoms. And you might want to jot that down, as you're listening in. I won't ask you to share it or anything. But you want to think about those symptoms and how they impact you at work and things that cause changes in your symptoms. Sometimes you might find that you have more difficulty in the morning than in the evening. You might find that later in the day is easier than in the beginning of the day. It's possible that if you are under a time pressure or a time constraint, maybe that makes your symptoms worse. Maybe the type of task or access to your environment, noises, smells, things that are distracting or problematic for you. That list is going to help us as we move through into this next step. So now you would have a list of some of the symptoms that you experience and how they might impact you at work and what causes your symptoms to change or to get worse. We want to take that information and we want to think about what you might need in your workplace. You might need help to avoid those symptoms from getting worse, or you might need help avoiding experiencing them altogether. You might need to figure out something that's going to help you work around those symptoms so that you can complete your tasks and they don't impact your health or your work. It sounds maybe obvious, but figuring this out starts with knowing what your job is. When you're searching for a new job, most advertisements will include in the job description the essential job functions. If those are listed in the advertisements, they're probably included in your job offer. And if they aren't included in your job offer, they should exist somewhere in your department or in human resources. The reason that essential functions are important is that these are the things that an employee must be able to do to fulfill their job duties with or without a reasonable accommodation. For example, a warehouse job might list ability to lift 50 pounds. These are important because this is how it's determined if an employer has discriminated against an employee with a disability. If you aren't able to complete the essential functions of your job with or without an accommodation, your employer has a right to counsel you about your performance, or to let you go or take whatever action is, outlined for your department. And that's not considered discrimination. Now, if you are able to complete those essential job functions with reasonable accommodations, then that protects you from any sort of action that could be taken against you for having that disability. And so that's why it's really important that we know what the essential functions of the job are. I don't know about you, but I have essential functions of my job, and then also probably 20 or 30 other things that I just have ended up doing over time. But certainly as a professor, an essential function of my job is teaching classes. And so I could have accommodations like maybe I need to sit on a stool, or maybe I need my classes to be scheduled in the morning because that's when I function better and my symptoms aren't as problematic for me. Those are all things that might be reasonable to request. But if I can't actually teach classes and there's no accommodation that facilitates me being able to do that, then that becomes a different discussion about whether I'm equipped to do this job or not. There's an example on the slide. It's from the city of Gainesville. It has a nice list of essential job functions there. So I would ask you to consider if you actually know what the essential functions of your job are. If you've been in your job for a long time, you may not know what that bulleted list really is. If you are in charge of some of the HR functions in your department or your area, it's worth considering if that information is easily accessible. Is it up to date? Because if your employees needed that information in order to have a discussion about accommodations, they should be able to access that and be able to identify the things that are absolutely required of them in the context of their job. All right, so what is an accommodation anyway? The US Department of Labor defines it this way. A job accommodation is an adjustment to a job or work environment that makes it possible for an individual with a disability to perform their job duties. Accommodations may include specialized equipment, modifications to the work environment, or adjustments to work schedules or responsibilities. Accommodations also don't apply only to the job. You actually also are entitled to accommodations as a person with a disability in the process of applying for a job. Many times if you've applied for a position, you'll see a little clause at the bottom that says if you need assistance applying, to reach out to an office or a particular number or person in order to facilitate that. Once you have the job, the employer then has to provide accommodations so that you can perform your job duties. Now, an important note here that doesn't really apply to UF, but the ADA and the requirement to provide accommodations actually only applies to organizations with more than 15 employees. Of course, at UF, that doesn't apply to us, but any information you kind of have or knowledge you have about accommodations may not apply, to a spouse or a friend who is working for a small company. And if you are hiring somebody in from a small company, they also may not be particularly used to the process of requesting accommodations or know what's even available. You also have the right beyond accommodations to apply for the job, accommodations once you're on the job. You also have the right to engage equally with other benefits that are provided to employees. So let's say, for example, your department provides a catered lunch for the office every week during your staff meeting. And you can participate in the staff meeting just fine, so there's no issue with your job duties, but you have celiac disease and you must eat a gluten-free diet. Because the food is a benefit provided to all employees, your manager needs to make sure that they include a gluten-free option in the order so that you can participate in that benefit. That applies if a company gym is available. Any kind of benefit that is offered to everybody must also be accessible. The other important thing to know is that job accommodations are not one size fits all. That means that every person you've met who has autism or ADHD or is going through multiple sclerosis or cancer treatments, whatever the condition is, those folks may not all need the exact same thing. So for you, that's why it's important, if you're going to be requesting accommodations, that you take a moment to consider what your unique experience is like and how that'll look for you at work. If you're somebody who might be receiving requests for accommodations in the workplace, it's also important to sort of check any experiences you've had in other situations with different diagnoses. And remember that what worked for one person may not work for another person. Another very important thing about accommodations is they have to be considered reasonable. So we've talked a few times, or I've mentioned requesting reasonable accommodations. So what exactly is reasonable? To decide if an accommodation is reasonable, the first general guideline is that it has to make sense. It has to be feasible, plausible, and address your needs. So let's say that you have issues with fatigue and you want to request an accommodation for that. You stand a lot in your job, and so asking for a stool to sit on is feasible. It's easy enough to do. It's plausible. It makes sense that standing could contribute to fatigue, and a stool would address your need because you'd be able to sit. But let's say instead of asking for a stool, you ask for permission to play loud rock music on a speaker to address your fatigue. That's probably not as feasible because it might disrupt others, and it doesn't really seem like a plausible way to address your fatigue. Of course, different people need different things, as I just said, but a good rule of thumb is that the more obvious it is that your accommodation would help, the easier it's going to be to request it and to have it implemented. If your accommodation makes sense to you, but it isn't necessarily obvious to somebody else, there are steps for that, and we'll discuss how to handle that. You also have to consider if your request is going to pose an undue hardship to the employer. An employer isn't required to make an accommodation that's going to jeopardize their financial security or the operations of the business. So again, as an instructor and as a professor, no one's required to make an accommodation for me to not teach. That's what I'm supposed to do. And if I am accommodated in such a way that I just don't have to teach any more classes, that's going to shift the burden of those classes onto somebody else. And so that's going to create an undue hardship for my department. And so that request to just not teach classes anymore would be an undue hardship and would not be a reasonable accommodation. I could give you another example. Let's imagine that you're working in a retail store and you want an accommodation to adjust your work hours to start at 10 a.m. because you take a medicine that makes you really groggy in the morning. The store opens at 8 and you work the morning shift. That's probably going to pose an undue hardship because it would either leave the store short-staffed or delay opening. In an example at UF, you can ask for schedule change, but if your team always has a 9 a.m. check-in meeting every morning, and you're requesting to start your day at 10 o'clock, it may not work because you're not going to be able to attend that important 9 a.m. meeting. Now, it's possible that your team could move that meeting. Maybe for whatever reason, a 10 a.m. meeting is no different than a 9 a.m. meeting, then that could be a reasonable accommodation. Again, it's so highly variable depending on the nature of the work you do, the team, the people that are relying on you, and the job description that you have. The other thing that's important to know is that your employer doesn't have to pay for personal devices that you use outside of work. So I do need my glasses in order to do my work, but UF is not responsible for my vision appointments and purchasing my glasses for me. So that includes things like hearing aids and prosthetic legs and any other similar device that's a personal device. So given that it's highly variable and highly dependent upon what work you do, what setting you're in, the size of your team, all of those different things, what can you even ask for as an accommodation? There are lots of different options, and this is a general list that you can consider. So assistive technology is going to be anything usually that relates to a computer program or an app or a type of software, maybe the setup or layout of your computer. So if you have trouble, let's say, reading long documents, a device that will read it to you would be a form of assistive technology. You can ask for flexibility in scheduling. That can include things like additional leave time, scheduled breaks, or work from home arrangements. You can actually ask for job restructuring, which might mean additional training or transitioning to an alternate open position. So your employer, UF, is not required to make a new position for you. Let's say in my example as an instructor, if for some reason I can't teach classes anymore, UF does not have to make up a new job for me that includes things I can do. But there might be an open position in my department that I'm also qualified for that I can do. And the option to transfer into that position could be a reasonable accommodation. You can request environmental modifications. So that can be moving to a different cubicle or facing a certain direction that helps you to focus or moves you away from smells or noises. Things like lamps instead of overhead lighting, noise canceling headphones, the option to have a smell-free workplace, so asking that people not use fragrances. And then you can ask for a modification to standard policies. So an example of that is you would like to wear a company t-shirt instead of the uniform polo shirt. Because maybe you have some sensory sensitivities and that polo shirt and that collar are just really uncomfortable for you. But in order to be in uniform, you would just wear a t-shirt instead. You might need permission to request leave time without the required notice. So maybe your department has a policy where you have to request leave at least, 3 weeks in advance. But the nature of your situation is that you might have unexpected needs for leave. And so an accommodation could be just for some flexibility in that policy. There are lots and lots more examples. And the website that I would direct you to is askjan.org. And I have it pulled up here. I'm going to switch screens over and share it with you. So JAN is the Job Accommodation Network, and it's got some really great information if you are the employer as well as if you're the individual. But my two favorite things on this website are the A to Z list and the accommodation search. So under the accommodation search, you can search for the symptom that you have, decreased stamina, or you can search for the actual condition itself, like ADHD. And when you click on that, it's going to give you a whole bunch of different information. So it's basically going to pull every article or piece of information they have on this website related to ADHD. And then you can come over here and you can narrow that down a little bit to get to more specific information that you're looking for. Maybe you're recently diagnosed and you still are trying to understand how ADHD in the workplace impacts you. So there's some educational articles there. The other thing that is really incredible on this website is when you click on the A to Z list, there is an A to Z list of everything that you could possibly imagine in terms of different conditions. So let's say Raynaud's disease. It's going to give you some information about Raynaud's. It's going to give you some questions you might want to consider. And then it's going to list for you some of the accommodations that might be helpful for a person with that condition. It's going to give you specific ideas by limitation, so by symptom, but also by work-related function. So temperature is a really big thing for folks with Raynaud's. And so it's going to give you some ideas for things that you could do to address sensitivity to cold or heat. And again, it's got even more information that I could cover in just a few minutes. It goes by topic, by accommodation. So maybe you just want to understand a little bit more about options for policies and dress code. And then there's going to be a beautiful article there that's going to give you tons and tons of examples. So that is askjan.org. And I'd highly encourage you to bookmark that one and utilize that both for your own needs and if you're an employer helping somebody else think about their accommodations. So we've done a bunch of things now. We've got a list of our symptoms. We understand our disability. We understand how it impacts us. We've thought about what are the things that make it easier, harder? What change the way that my symptoms show up for me? We've thought about what our essential functions are for our job, and we've considered how that set of symptoms we talked about might impact us. And then we've started to think about what accommodations might help us in the workplace. And we've got our website tool if we need it, or maybe we're able to think of those ideas on our own. So now we have to actually let somebody know that we need accommodations. And so the very first thing that you need to know about accommodations is that you actually have to ask. Your employer, UF, your department, your manager is not required to provide any accommodations unless the employee actually requests it. In fact, there are some tricky things about an employer coming to you and saying, you know, I've noticed that you seem to have this symptom or you seem like you have ADHD, and I wonder if this would help. No matter how well-intentioned that might be, it's actually problematic for your employer to come and suggest that you have a disability or a problem. And so your employer is not going to do this process for you or initiate this process. When you approach your employer, you want to think about explaining the problem that you're having, the solutions that you're proposing, and think about the benefits that that's going to have for the company. So an example of that is I have a hard time focusing when there's a lot of background noise. I think it would help if I could move to the corner cubicle that's open. And if I can focus better, I think I can get those reports done more quickly. You might notice in this example that it never mentions a disability by name. When you make your request to your immediate supervisor for a reasonable accommodation, you are not required to share anything at all about your disability, and you do not have to provide any medical records. This is just the initial ask that starts the process. And sometimes the process is really straightforward. If you have a really obvious disability with an obvious solution, I have a broken foot, I need to sit on a stool. Your employer is likely to just grant that accommodation. Sometimes a disability isn't so obvious, or the solution isn't really clear. You might have some ideas about what could be reasonable, but it's going to require a little more thinking through. And in those cases, your employer might want more information. So in that case, you start a different process where you are going to let a different person know about your disability. In a big organization like UF, if I want to make a request to my immediate supervisor, but for some reason I don't want to share about the type of disability I have, then the rest of that process will go through HR or the ADA office or some other person, so that there is a designated individual who is going to get access to my medical records if needed, who will know information about my disability, but that information is going to be protected and separate from my supervisor or my direct employer. I see a question. Is it inappropriate to share a diagnosis for a non-obvious condition to your supervisor? Not at all, and it's entirely up to you. You might feel like it's just easier to let that information kind of be complete. and you might feel like it's going to help the other person understand and make more sense. But there's lots of different reasons why people feel like they don't really want to disclose the specific medical information. In an ideal world, you could disclose your disability and nobody would have assumptions or thoughts about what that means. But you might fear that by telling somebody you have this condition, they might make assumptions about your abilities, and you'd rather that your supervisor just not know directly what's wrong with you. Maybe it's a diagnosis you're just kind of adapting to, and you still don't really want to share it with a bunch of people, but you know you need help and you need accommodations. So it's entirely up to you to decide if disclosing the actual disability is of benefit to you in this process. But as soon as you make that ask to your employer, we have started the interactive process. And so the interactive process is the term that's used for this sort of mutual collaboration between you and your employer in order to figure out what reasonable accommodations will be instituted in order to address your needs. So in the interactive process, that usually will take place with HR or the ADA office. Maybe in your college, you have a specific HR person. The interactive process could be pretty simple. It might even just be with your direct supervisor if the negotiation between what you're asking for and what they can provide is going to be pretty simple. I know, for example, if I really needed to teach my classes in the morning, I could talk to my program director who does our scheduling. We could discuss, is that every semester? Is that just this semester? Is it every day? And I don't think it would be a problem, and that would probably be the end of it. And I don't know that I'd ever even have to really explain why. But if you are in a situation where that discussion needs to be a little more in depth, then the interactive process is going to be kind of an ongoing process where you might have to provide some medical records that explain what you need. Your boss might, or the person who's handling the interactive process might suggest an accommodation that you try out, and then you come back and say, you know, that kind of helped, or actually that didn't really fix the problem. So think about the interactive process as being this collaborative time period. It's not a one and done conversation where you ask for what you need, your company tells you what they can deliver, you go back and forth until you reach a place where you hopefully have a set of solutions that work for you. A couple of kind of FAQs. Can your employer ignore your request? No. Once you've asked for a reasonable accommodation, they are obligated to either provide the accommodation or start the interactive process to get more information. So your immediate supervisor cannot just ignore the fact that you've mentioned you need something. Can they ask for your medical records? Again, yes. Your employer can ask for proof of your disability. Typically in larger companies and organizations like UF, that process is handled through a separate department so that it's not going through your immediate supervisor. Does your employee have to have medical records? No. There's not a necessity for them. Again, sometimes the request you're making might be pretty straightforward and they don't really feel like they need to understand your request more in order to grant it. So it's also possible that you'll ask for something and no one will ever ask for your medical records. If your employer asks you for those records and you refuse, they can deny your accommodation request. So this typically happens more so when you're asking for things that require more substantial financial investments or more substantial efforts to meet that accommodation. They're not necessarily undue hardships. They just are going to require a little bit more. For example, if I want my department to purchase a specific standing desk with a specific computer setup in order to address ergonomics and support issues I have with my neck, if that's a $5,000 investment, it's not necessarily an undue hardship for an organization like UF, but I am asking for $5,000 essentially. And so they may ask for my medical records in order to verify that I really do have this condition I say I have. And if I say, no, I don't really want to provide medical records, they can say, okay, we're not going to provide that standing desk for you then. Do they have to give you exactly what you asked for? No, and that's part of what the interactive process is. So I can bring my request for my $5,000 standing desk, and they can say, you know what, we have this contract with this other company, and this costs $3,000, and we think it will still meet the needs you've expressed. And so we're going to give you that instead. It's possible that your employer might even come up with a better idea. So this isn't always a bad thing. Your employer, especially the big organization like UF, has lots of experience of providing accommodations for people. And so you might think you have a really great idea for how to address the challenge you're having. And your employer might say, actually, I think this would help better. So this interactive process doesn't have to be a bad thing. It can seem a little bit scary. But in the best world, it's not a fight. It's really a collaboration to figure out what you need to function as best you can. And if you don't know what you need, that's also okay. You don't have to come with a solution. You can just come with the problem. I need an accommodation to address the noise that is in this space. I just cannot focus, but I don't know what we can do about it. And then again, that interactive process is designed so that you can have that discussion and figure out what you might need. Now, I always include this. We don't, I think, have this problem at UF, I would hope, as such a big organization and institution, but you might always, you can always run up against a situation where your employer won't provide accommodations that you feel are necessary. As a reminder, if you are working somewhere with less than 15 employees, they're not required to provide any accommodations for you. Hopefully that they can under, out of goodwill, but they're not required to. If it's a larger company, they are required to provide accommodations under ADA, but there's a couple questions you're going to have to ask yourself. If they've just said no, you can ask if there's other medical documentation that's needed, or you can provide additional medical information. If your proposed accommodation was an undue hardship, that doesn't mean it's a flat out no. That interactive process should continue. So you can reach out and say, well, then what is an option if this thing wasn't? Ultimately, if you believe that you have been denied unfairly, or you're in a situation where that discussion just isn't moving forward, you can file a complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So the EEOC is the governing body that would address that. So what I would ask you to kind of reflect on as you go through this process is, again, looking over the symptoms and the description that you have created of your disability, the challenges and the accommodations that you think might be helpful. And then it helps to consider how those accommodations can benefit your employer too. It's not a requirement that your accommodations benefit the employer, but it is a helpful way to advocate for your needs. Because if I can ask for what I need and also help you understand the benefit to you as a department or as part of the organization, the process for instituting that accommodation might be even easier. So if you can stop and think about what they get out of it, what does UF or your department or your college get out of this benefit and this request, it can make it a little bit easier in some cases to move that interactive process along. Kind of going backwards, because we talked about what happens for accommodations when you're already employed, I want to make sure we talk for a second about accommodations when you're applying for a job. And this would apply if you're transferring between positions at UF, or if you're applying for an entirely new position. Remember that Title I of the ADA includes the job application process. And so as a potential employer, we have to provide accommodations. That might look like an interpreter. It can look like providing the job questions ahead of time so that you have a little more time to prepare and think ahead. It can include things like a Zoom interview instead of an in-person interview, especially if you're working on a remote position that doesn't normally require you to come in person. But a couple of things that they are and are not allowed to do. They can ask you if you can perform the essential functions of your job, but they cannot ask you any specific questions about your medical history, your disability, your diagnosis, or your symptoms. So if I'm interviewing somebody, I can ask, are you able to accurately input data into the computer? I can't ask, what's your eyeglass prescription? I can't ask, are you able to see the keyboard? I can ask, are you able to lift boxes from the ground that weigh 25 pounds? But I can't ask, how bad is your back? Or why do you need that accommodation? Your employer should provide those accommodations to participate in the job application process. And again, just like with the job you already have, there's probably a designated person who will handle any requests for accommodations. And any medical information you disclose to them, that person, as part of requesting the accommodations, should not be shared with the hiring manager. Now, there are some situations where the hiring manager may need some information. If I'm requesting an ASL interpreter, obviously the hiring manager is going to see that there's another person in the room and is probably going to piece together why. So there are some situations where the hiring manager may need some information in order to actually provide the accommodations, but knowledge of your disability should be kept separate from the hiring manager in most situations. You cannot require a medical examination for the job application or for employment unless a medical exam is required for everybody who's hired into that position. If you do need accommodations for the hiring process, consider what you want to share and how you want to share it. You want to notify the employer as soon as possible. You want to give them plenty of time to implement whatever it is that you need. In this case especially, it's helpful to know what accommodation you need. The interactive process isn't quite the same here, and so it's harder to, call up a company and say, I need something to help me with this interview, but I don't know what. So you want to make sure that you really know what it is that you need in order to participate in that interview. And then again, have that documentation ready. So a person can ask for it, not the hiring manager, but whomever handles the HR side of things. And so you want to have it ready just so that if you're in the application process, it's not something that's going to hold things up or they're going to move on to another candidate. I can ask Brandon to share some of these websites if you'd like, but the main ones I want to point out are just the EEOC.gov, which has lots of great information on some of the more legal aspects of accommodations and employment. And then again, that askjan.org is really helpful for that as well. That's all I have for you today. Thank you for your time and your attention. And if I can be of any help personally or professionally, please feel free to reach out.